The way global trade is all tangled up these days, it really can feel, well, overwhelming, can't it?
It really can.
And smack bang in the middle of it all is the U.S. and China. That relationship, it seems to ripple out and affect just about everything everywhere.
Absolutely. It's got incredibly high stakes. I mean, it's not just about those two countries. It's really shaping international commerce for all of us.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've gone through, well, quite a bit of material expert takes, the latest economic numbers, even official government lines,
Yeah, try and get a real sense of it all.
to really get under the skin of where things stand with U.S.-China trade and maybe where they're headed. Those recent talks in Geneva, the high-level ones, they've really put a spotlight on it.
Definitely brought it to the forefront again.
So our mission here is to, cut through the noise a bit, understand the real dynamics, the potential outcomes, and what it all means more broadly, like for the EU and just global trade in general.
And the sources we have, they give a pretty rich, multi-layered picture. It lets us look past just the day-to-day policy moves and see the bigger strategies, the assumptions driving things.
Okay, so maybe let's try and see this from Beijing's angle first. There seems to be this feeling among Chinese scholars, like they're not optimistic about the U.S. relationship,
Yeah.
but still pretty confident they can handle whatever comes their way.
That's a really key point. There's definitely pessimism about the bilateral relationship, no doubt. But yeah, it's paired with this strong belief in China's own resilience, its ability to withstand U.S. pressure.
And part of that is thinking the U.S. will eventually have to make a deal.
That's a big part of it. The expectation is that sooner or later, Washington will see the need to come to some kind of agreement.
Interesting. What's really behind this confidence, though? It can't just be wishful thinking, right?
No, it's built on a few things. First, there's this widely held view that global power is shifting. U.S. influence seen as waning a bit, relatively speaking, while China's is growing. Things like the financial crisis, recent U.S. policy shifts, they've set into that perception.
Right.
Second, China sees its own strength increasing diplomatically, economically, militarily. And third, well, it's just smart strategy, isn't it? They need to diversify their international ties so they're not totally reliant on the U.S. relationship.
So it's a kind of calculated resilience.
You could say that, yeah. Based on perceived power shifts and actively building other partnerships, the old levers the U.S. used might not work the same way anymore.
So it's not just about defense, it's also about actively trying to reshape things.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest China sees openings, especially with the second Trump administration's approach.
Exactly. They see the U.S. maybe pulling back from multilateral stuff, from certain agreements, and they plan to step into that space by being more active in international bodies, boosting development aid, expanding their diplomatic presence. The message they want to send is China's a responsible great power, offering a different, maybe more stable global order.
That's quite a strategic play, especially the trade angle, using U.S. protectionism to make themselves look like the champions of free trade.
Precisely. It's a narrative thing. Contrast their rhetoric about open trade with U.S. tariffs and hope that wins them points in trade with countries feeling squeezed by the U.S.
And reaching out to nations maybe feeling a bit alienated by Washington.
Actively doing that, yes. It's all part of the strategy.
Okay, let's switch tracks a bit to the hard economics. I mean, despite all the friction, trade between the U.S. and China was still pretty significant in early 2025, right?
It was, yes. The volume was still substantial. But the trade war's impact is undeniable, especially after those new tariff hikes in April 2025.
Right, those were big jumps, weren't they? Give us a sense of the scale.
Huge jumps. So remember, the U.S. trade deficit with China didn't really go away despite the first round of Trump tariffs. Then, April 2025, the U.S. ramps things up. Combined tariffs hit 145% on a lot of Chinese goods.
145%. Wow.
Yeah. And China hit back fast. Their retaliatory tariffs reached 125% on U.S. goods. At those levels, you're essentially pricing many goods right out of the market. Businesses face enormous cost hikes, or they scramble for new suppliers, or, well, you end up paying a lot more.
Ouch. So who gets hurt most by these kinds of numbers? What are the forecasts saying?
Well, most projections suggest the U.S. economy is actually likely to feel more pain from these tariffs than many other trade partners.
Really? Why is that?
Partly because China's economy isn't as dependent on exporting to the U.S. as it once was. That kind of weakens the leverage the U.S. tariffs might have. But the U.S. is still very dependent on imports from China. So American consumers, American businesses, they'll likely keep buying, just at much, much higher prices.
So the U.S. might be shooting itself in the foot to some extent. And Our sources also suggest this could drag on because China isn't exactly rushing to the negotiating table.
That's a critical point. The seeming reluctance from Beijing for top-level talks, it does suggest these tensions could stick around for a while. And you see things like the U.S. trade rep proposing new fees on Chinese shipbuilding.
Right. I
Yeah,
saw that.
it just shows the potential for this to keep escalating, moving beyond just tariffs on goods.
Okay, let's look at China's response more directly. They've put out these white papers, sort of defending their economic position. What are the key messages they're trying to get across, especially to the U.S.?
Well, the recent white paper aimed at the U.S. makes a few core arguments. First, it really highlights China as a key growth market, especially for things like U.S. agriculture and energy sectors important to Trump's base.
A strategic reminder, then.
Exactly. Second, it points out how much U.S. companies sell within China, arguing those sales help balance out the goods trade deficit. And then there are the worries they express.
Worries about.
Things like the U.S. potentially ending most favored nation status or changing the de minimis policy.
Okay, hang on, de minimis. Can you just quickly unpack that for us? Why is that a big deal here?
Sure. So de minimis basically lets small, low-value shipments enter a country, usually without facing tariffs or lots of customs paperwork.
Ah, okay, like stuff you buy online.
Often, yes. So if the U.S. scraps that for China, it suddenly makes exporting lots of smaller, cheaper items much more expensive and complicated for Chinese sellers. It hits e-commerce hard.
Got it. So China's making targeted economic arguments while signaling concern about further restrictions. Meanwhile, the U.S. focus in the Indo-Pacific seems to be shifting more towards economics, too.
Yes, that seems to be the priority for the second Trump administration in that region. Even talk about naval power often circles back to, well, shipbuilding industries. And it's telling that those April 2025 tariff hikes didn't just hit China, they hit U.S. allies in the Western Pacific, too.
Really. Allies as well.
Yep, suggesting a broad push for trade deals seen as more favorable to the U.S. across the board.
And what about the security side? We heard the U.S. reaction to China's military drills near Taiwan was maybe a bit low-key.
Relatively muted, yes. That, plus the consistent talk about maintaining the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, it suggests economic issues are taking precedence over immediate security interventions right now. Less focus on, say, dramatically boosting military aid to Taiwan at this moment.
That has to have geopolitical ripples, surely.
Sure.
Thinking about trust in the U.S. and East Asia.
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing public opinion data from several U.S. allies and partners there showing a dip in confidence about U.S. reliability.
And what happens then?
Well, it's making some countries think about other options, maybe being a bit more accommodating towards China if Beijing addresses their concerns. You're even hearing more talk, maybe preliminary, about nuclear capabilities in some places.
Wow, that's a serious potential shift. And it's not just security, is it? There was that meeting, China, Japan, South Korea trade ministers.
Yes, that trilateral meeting aiming to speed up talks on their own free trade agreement. That's really noteworthy.
Why specifically?
Because seeing these major regional economies pushing for closer ties among themselves while U.S. tariffs are rising points towards, well, maybe a more regionally integrated economic bloc, potentially with China more central. And add to that, trust in the U.S. seems to be trending down in Taiwan, too.
So the overall analysis points towards a more China-led region may be happening without a major war.
The trend lines seem to suggest a move in that direction, yes. Potentially a shift achieved through economic and diplomatic means rather than large-scale conflict.
Okay, so if that's the regional picture, what about the EU? How does this bigger U.S.-China fight hit Europe?
It's expected to pose some real challenges for the EU. Think about it. Those Chinese exports that can't easily go to the U.S. because of tariffs, they need to go somewhere.
Europe being a likely destination.
A very likely destination. And we're not just talking basic goods anymore. These are increasingly higher value, more sophisticated products. That means more direct competition for key European industries.
Leading to more EU-China trade spats.
It seems quite likely, yes. New disputes could easily flare up.
But is there any potential upside for the EU in all this? I think our sources mentioned something about increased leverage.
Yes, there's a potential silver lining. If the U.S. and China really do decouple significantly, or at least weaken their ties, both Washington and Beijing might become more reliant on the EU as a major economic partner.
Making Europe more important to both sides.
Potentially, yes. Which could give the EU more bargaining power, but to really make the most of that, the EU needs to push harder on its whole open strategic autonomy idea.
Right. And what does that actually mean in practice here? What do they need to do?
It means doing several things at once, really. Diversifying economic ties, more trade deals with regions like Southeast Asia, Latin America, strengthening diplomatic links with Africa, India, and crucially, boosting the EU's own capabilities, becoming more self-reliant in key areas.
Okay, let's zoom in on the event that kicked off a lot of this recent analysis, those Geneva talks on May 10th. What actually happened there?
Well, we know the meeting took place. High-level officials, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Trade Rep Jameson Greer, and on the tiny side, Vice Premier He Lifeng.
And this was the first formal sit-down since the big tariff hikes.
That's right, the first proper round of talks since that April escalation.
Now, Trump had hinted at maybe lowering tariffs before the talks, hadn't he? Something like 80%?
He had mentioned that possibility, yes, but China's public stance has been pretty consistent. They want all the tariffs gone, completely.
Oh, a big gap there.
A very big gap. The main goal of the talks was really just to see if they could cool things down, find any path to reducing the tariffs. But, expectations for a major breakthrough were, frankly, pretty low.
Still, any step towards talking is probably better than nothing for global markets, I suppose. Did the WTO weigh in?
They did. The WTO Director General called the talks themselves a positive step, towards de-escalation. A spokesperson stressed how vital it is for the world's two biggest economies to keep talking.
Right. And one concrete thing that did happen around this time was the end of that de minimis loophole for Chinese goods into the U.S.
Yes, that exemption got eliminated, which, as we discussed, could mean higher prices for online shoppers buying directly from China.
Okay. And finally, let's circle back to that core issue, the trade imbalance. The views on why it exists are just miles apart, aren't they? What's China's argument again?
China's line laid out in that white paper is basically that the U.S. goods deficit isn't just because China wants a surplus. They argue it's down to structural things in the U.S. economy itself and just how global production is organized.
So not solely China's fault, they'd say.
Right. And they argue you have to look at the whole picture, include trade and services, where the U.S. runs a surplus with China, and also count the sales U.S. companies make inside China and vice versa.
And if you add all that up,
China claims the overall economic benefits flowing back and forth are actually pretty balanced. And then, of course, they accuse the U.S. of unilateralism, economic hegemony, with things like the Section 301 tariffs pointing to the WTO disputes over them.
okay, so summing up then, we've got this really complex, seemingly escalating U.S.-China trade relationship, huge global consequences, totally different stories about why the imbalances exist. And despite the recent Geneva talks, well, the outcome still feels pretty uncertain.
That captures it well. Continued friction seems likely, maybe even probable. And other big players, like the EU, they really have to figure out how to navigate this shifting, challenging landscape. It's not getting any simpler.
Definitely not. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you listening. With all these moving parts, this deep interconnectedness, what are the real long-term consequences of this evolving U.S.-China dynamic for, well, global stability, for prosperity? And maybe more practically, what steps should individuals, businesses, even entire nations start thinking about now in response to this changing world order?